Hi, guys. Thank you for coming for this talk. I know you have lots of other good options. Um, I'm happy to be back at EC. I was telling Sean earlier that the last time I was at EC was in 2006 when my colleague Foster and I did a tutorial on network science. So it's been 13 years and happy to be here. Um, that that was in a cooler place, but that's I don't remember where it was, but I do know that it wasn't as hot. So this is joint work with Apostolos Filippas, who just graduated from NYU about a year ago, and Srikanth Jagabathula, who's a colleague with a joint appointment at NYU and Harvard. It has a long title, which is sort of symptomatic of young co-authors who want to sort of put all the words related to the topic in the title. But the so the main context is that over the last few years, like many of you, I've been fascinated by the emergence of these entities that we call platforms that are not traditional sort of hands-off marketplaces that match supply and demand. They're not traditional organizations either that sort of hire people full time and pay them a salary in exchange for their labor and talent and produce goods and services which are then delivered to customers. They're sort of somewhere in between. Some of what a traditional organization does is done by the platform, some of it is delegated to the providers. And so there's this complex sort of coordination that has to be done by a platform depending on the extent to which it is doing stuff itself and the extent to which it is delegating stuff to the providers who are providing through the platform. So, and then there are rules set that then sort of govern provider behavior. And so an early example of a platform like this is, Taobao, the Alibaba marketplace, but a more familiar one is Amazon seller marketplace. I was at Amazon on Thursday, and they told me that 58% of stuff sold on Amazon is now sold by sellers, third-party sellers, 2 million of them. And so these sellers, do a bunch of things. They set their own prices, they manage their own inventory. There are specific rules, like if you're the lowest price in a category, then you get into the buy box. And Amazon has sort of set these rules. They're transparent, and so you know that if you sort of undercut your competition, you're going to be sort of like front and center, like with a few other sort of like considerations. Now, you take a different platform like Airbnb, which is now bigger than Marriott, Starwood, and Hilton put together in terms of like the number of people it's accommodating every night, and has more inventory than like the top 7 of the world's hotel chains. Again, like it's one of those hybrids. People are setting price, they're managing inventory. There's not real transparency about as a provider what if I make this particular menu of choices, how am I going to be displayed on Airbnb? Um, Airbnb also has a centralized pricing tool. They can tell you what your price should be, but they have chosen not to impose this price on you, but rather to suggest it to you. Um, Now, if you go to the ride-sharing space, I mean, there's a wide variety of giants who we're all familiar with, Didi, Uber, Lyft. Over here, the sort of balance between delegation and control is very different. Uber, Lyft, and Didi all set prices themselves. The drivers still, in a sense, sort of manage their own availability. There's a wide variety of design decisions that these platforms have made that determine, like, sort of how the choices of providers are mapped to outcomes. Like, sort of what is the price level, what is the price per trip, how are drivers and passengers matched? I mean, like, how are people put into shared rides? But I have noticed a tendency among the platforms to move closer and closer to sort of imposing decisions on providers rather than letting them make them. So, for example, it's more common for a ride to be assigned to a driver rather than a driver choosing whether or not to accept that ride. With in Didi's case, it sort of happens automatically. Um, there was a platform called Sidecar a few years ago that allowed drivers to set their own prices. For a wide variety of reasons, Sidecar failed, but one of the reasons seemed to be related to the fact that the market really didn't want like a menu of 7 prices and then sort of choosing. Consumers seem to want to be able to choose their own prices. So Sidecar's experiment with trying to allow providers to set prices like did not end in success. Another example of a platform like this is a platform called BlaBlaCar in France, which allows people to book rides in other people's empty seats when they're traveling from one city to another. There's no good reason for me to be talking about BlaBlaCar in this talk, except that I like showing this video. when it plays. Yes, and this is sort of people traveling in empty seats in each other's cars from city to city. Like I'm, blown away by the fact that this model of sort of so a BlaBlaCar provider will set their price, will manage their availability. It's not like a centralized train schedule. But they're carrying like 3 times as many people every day now, as Amtrak carries every day. So in some sense, they've sort of created this infrastructure out of like, a platform and, millions of decentralized drivers. And so my interest in this topic comes from the fact that there's a incredible array of industries in which the eventual institution that is coordinating the economic activity is moving away from the 20th century organizations that we got used to and to these firm market hybrids that have to make design choices about what to centralize and what to decentralize. I'm seeing them emerge in professional services, in healthcare, in energy, in education, across the board. It seems like we are creating this new generation of digitally enabled institutions that are changing the role of who provides trust and are reshaping who holds what my management colleagues call structural capital. The know-how associated with providing conducting the economic activity and the decisions associated with that. So there's a wide array from, if you're selling on Etsy, you're making all the decisions, to if you're selling on Airbnb, there's a little bit more control and merchandising, to if you're sort of driving on Uber, there's far more centralized control. So this paper is about these design trade-offs. The big question is, what is the optimal design of a platform? This is not the question that this paper is answering. But it's really sort of based on the observation that as a platform grows, often, I've noticed that they need to make design changes. And so, often they're trading off, like, how much do the providers know versus how much do I know centrally? Should I use revenue management, or should I let them sort of use their local expertise? Often there's a tension between what the platform is trying to optimize and what the providers are trying to optimize. And so, many platforms start out with some balance between decentralization and control. But then over time, as they grow, they want to change. They want to sort of be light touch initially so that they can scale rapidly. But then they hire data scientists. They hire you guys as consultants. They sort of say, well, like, if we're offering rides across the city, there should be consistency in pricing. There should be consistency in merchandising. A competitor might say, well, I've got uniform pricing. What are you going to do about it? But the challenge with managing this transition is that the providers have an expectation of this is how things work. If Airbnb hosts suddenly can't price, they're going to be upset because they're used to pricing. They think that they know how much their apartment is worth. And so there's sort of a transition management issue that comes from changing these market mechanisms as a platform scale, and that's the context of my study. The industry that I studied it in is peer-to-peer car rental. Many of you have used peer-to-peer car rental. The United States has 2 large players, Getaround and Turo. My research partner is Getaround, which recently acquired Drivey. They're much more of a everyday use of cars kind of platform rather than Turo, which is much more of a fly to a new city and rent it at the airport. Getaround's way of operating for many years was providers would bring their cars to the platform. They would set availability. These are the hours that they're available for rent. They would choose a price, an hourly price, a daily price, weekly price. And then after someone booked their car, there was equipment in the car like Zipcar. If they decided that they needed the car, they could cancel the transaction. So they had transaction approval as well. Renters just sort of went, searched, compared, and chose. And the platform provided search and discovery, some trust, some risk management, and the access technology to be able to sort of rent someone else's car. And the status quo before we started our study was that people would just sort of set an hourly price. That was sort of the level of control that a provider had over pricing. The platform had noticed that 2 things. One was that the number of hours that a vehicle was listed for rent versus the number of hours was actually rented, there was sort of a pretty big gap on average. I think utilization was about 10%. A lot of this has to do with the fact that you might just sort of list your car for hours that people in which people may not want to rent, but it also sort of like, they also started to feel as they grew that maybe there's some money we're leaving on the table in terms of like, optimizing utilization. They also noticed that while providers had pricing control, very few of them actually made pricing changes. They weren't sort of sitting there with their spreadsheets or their Python code, like sitting and optimizing and sort of making changes. I mean, like the median provider would like, make no changes in any given month. And so in the summer of 2017, we ran our experiment. And the experiment was motivated in part by the fact that Turo had moved to a centralized uniform pricing system where all Toyota Camrys of a particular, like all cars of a particular make, model, and potentially year were priced uniformly. This was done by a centralized revenue management style pricing algorithm. And Getaround was toying with the idea of like, transitioning from a decentralized to a centralized pricing system. They had, they had a crack data science team. They had come up with sort of like, this really cool algorithm. And the experiment we ran for 8 weeks over the summer of 2017 was to choose sort of a subset of a pool of users in the San Francisco Bay Area. We didn't choose all the users because we wanted to report numbers of users, and we had to keep the user base numbers confidential. Then we split them into 3 groups. About 70% of them stayed the way they were, and 30% of them were put in a treatment group, and I'll explain the 2 treatment groups in a minute. So the control group was status quo. They set their own prices. The treatment group 1, all pricing control was taken away from the users, from the providers. So they could not control price at all. The system sort of set prices for them. And as you can see, this is sort of a time-varying price that was meant to sort of optimize revenue for the platform. And then the second treatment group was given some control, meaning like, the system was still setting the price for them, but they had a slider that they could move where they could sort of raise or lower the total pricing level. So if they felt the prices were too low, they could sort of raise them. If they felt the prices were too high, they could lower them. And so this was a vehicle for potentially exploiting sort of local, demand information. Okay, so these were the 3 groups. I mean, control, status quo, treatment 1, complete sort of like, centralization, and treatment 2, partial centralization. So the first result was that the data scientists had done their job at Getaround, and for the people for whom pricing control was taken away, there was like over a 50% increase in revenue on average. And this revenue increase came from significantly lower prices and a massive increase of like, more than doubling of utilization. However, there were also sort of very significant sort of negative reactions from the providers for whom pricing control was taken away. A significant fraction of them left the platform. A significant fraction of them stayed on the platform but cut their availability significantly. And a significant fraction of them, the frequency with which they would cancel rides that were booked also went up by a significant amount. And so we initially called these like exit, voice, and availability, the cancellation being sort of an expression of voice. What was interesting was when we compared the treatment 1 group with the treatment 2 group. Treatment 2 were the people who had partial control over pricing. We found that there weren't significant differences we could discern in like, the revenue bump. There was a significant revenue bump for T2 as well as T1, although utilization rates for T2 were significantly lower. And the reason for that was that the negative reactions from the people who had partial control were far less adverse. They exited the platform at much lower rates. They cut their availability at far lower rates, and they were much less likely to cancel transactions as well. And so, total revenue, of course, is a simple measure, but each of these measures, like, churn from the platform, cutting availability, and cancellations, also have hard to quantify costs that go into a provider's objective function. And so by a measure of any sort of, pretty much any sort of objective function that you might sort of imagine, which combines churn, availability, cancellation, and total revenue, T2 seemed to be doing better than T1. Okay, so we've explored 2 theories that might explain these findings. One is that there's a misalignment of incentives between the platform and the providers. Because the platforms are maximizing revenue, the providers may be maximizing not revenue, but profit, right? And so there's a cost that they bear per mile that the car is driven. And we think of these as two different types of costs. There are these bring to market costs, which is just sort of the cost of conducting a transaction by itself. And then there are depreciation costs, sort of per mile costs. And so we noticed that the costs per mile for both of the treatment groups were, or the revenue per mile for both of the treatment groups were significantly lower than they were for the control group. But the treatment two, the people who had partial control, were somehow able to use that control to raise their revenue per transaction. So they were mitigating to some extent through their control, it seemed, perhaps sort of excess bring to market costs. And so we haven't completed our analysis of which of the two, we're estimating depreciation rates using NADA and other data. But once we complete this, we'll have a better sense for whether this explains all of our results. The second explanation was better local demand information, but there didn't seem to be any evidence of that. The control didn't seem to sort of increase the revenue for the people. It lowered it slightly, but not in a statistically significant way. And the third explanation is sort of rooted in management, which is not a subject that I'm very well versed in. I'm trained as an economist and in OR, but my management colleagues tell me, and I've become familiar with this literature, that there's a sort of a widely accepted theory in management of psychological contracts between employees and firms, meaning that there are certain things that you contract on explicitly, but there are certain sort of implicit or tacit or unstated agreements that employees have with their firms that are not formally contracted on. And when these contracts are violated, they often lead to adverse reactions from the employees. So it seemed like that could translate over to the provider platform world, where providers felt that they were sort of had tacitly entered into this agreement, even if it wasn't explicit, that they had control over the pricing. And a violation of this was leading to sort of these negative reactions of exits, cancellations, and availability. And looking at the data, it seemed like there was some evidence that this might be the case through two different signals. One is that a majority of people who had the slider did not actually use it. They exited and they canceled and so on at much higher rates, but they did not actually use the economic lever that they were given. Simply the presence of it was sufficient for them to be happier than they otherwise would have been. And that happiness, I guess, is reflected in a post-experiment survey that we did that clarified that people who were in sort of group treatment 2, where they had that partial control, were more satisfied, were getting the same revenue, and were retaliating far less adversely, even though in general they did not use the control that they were given. So my takeaways are really that as platforms start to sort of as platforms continually are making these choices of how do we transition our design, coming up with a balance between control and decentralization and these transition strategies can lower these perceived psychological contract violations, can align incentives that you may have thought were aligned, but then you realize weren't, can buffer otherwise expensive errors. I mean, the platform was planning to launch no control. They ended up launching partial control, which was sort of an experimental victory for me. I don't work for a company, and so when my experiments lead to actual change in the real world, I feel a sense of of accomplishment. And it didn't happen in this case, but you can also sort of harness local market expertise. And the second takeaway is that we seem to find that even if centralized pricing might maximize short-term objectives, hybrid pricing might do better if you expand your objective function. And the third finding seemed to be one that was sort of familiar, that perceptions of control can be an effective lever in sort of getting people to accept change, even if they don't actually use the control. All right, so that's all I have. I'm easy to find. I wrote a book a few years ago, and so I've gotten used to advertising it on my last slide, shamelessly, the way that the PR people at the press told me to do. But if you have any questions and you don't get to ask them now, I'm easy to find online. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.